Well, hey, Village people and family and friends. My name's Travis Garner. I'm the lead pastor at the Village. I'm really glad that you're tuning in right now because I think that we're about to have a super important conversation tonight. And I think if you look around, there's no denying that this continues to be a really difficult season. It's a really divided time. It feels like a really divided time in our country. And I know for me that really never before in my lifetime have I felt more tension, particularly along racial lines and political lines, but just also in general among people. And I don't know about you, but I'm the type of person who always likes to try to find some space between people, not to be a divider, but to just be in conversation and be in dialogue and try to understand. And I feel like in many ways in our culture right now, that space where people are willing to listen and to try to learn, it feels like it's shrinking. And it feels like that's happening on every topic, but it especially feels like it's happening on topics of great importance. And as I read the New Testament, I feel a particular call for me as a person, as a pastor, and I also feel a particular call for us as a church. And when I read the New Testament, I'm reminded of this fact. The message of the gospel is for everyone. And so our calling card, if you read the New Testament, our calling card as followers of Jesus is supposed to be our love for one another. Jesus says that the world will know his disciples by how they love one another. In Ephesians, the Apostle Paul is writing, and this is the Message translation. He's writing about this theme of unity, and I absolutely love the way this is worded here in Ephesians chapter 4. He says, "You were all called to travel on the same road and in the same direction. So stay together, both outwardly and inwardly. You have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who rules over all, works through all, and is present in all. Everything you are and think and do is permeated with oneness." Everything you are and think and do is permeated with oneness. And then I've been thinking about what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, because I think it says some important things about where we are right now as a culture and as a nation. 1 Corinthians 12, Paul's talking about the body of Christ, the interconnectedness of all the followers of Jesus. And he says, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. And then he says this, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. And I think there's no denying right now that there's some suffering that's happening in our body. There's some sickness that's happening in the body. And I think that we have a particular call to try to lean into that and to try to understand that, try to hear about that, try to learn from what's happening so that we can figure out how we could move forward together. So I believe this is a really critical conversation that we're having tonight. And so I'm excited. You'll see me introduce my friends in just a minute. I'm excited to be joined by my friends Stephen Handy and Joy Bronson and then Chris Cummings from our church. And we're going to have tonight what we hope is just a really straightforward and honest conversation about some of the core realities of race in our culture and the intersection of race and the gospel, and what the gospel has to say about how followers of Jesus can engage in this, engage with one another, engage in our communities in a time like this one. So here's what I want to ask you to do. And I want to say this on the front end. You are probably going to hear some things tonight that are difficult for you to hear. You might hear some things tonight that are difficult for you to hear. You might hear some things tonight that you disagree with. You might be tempted as you hear some things, because this is sort of this is how things often go in our culture. You might be tempted to tune it out if you disagree with it, or if it's difficult to try to understand or to try to hear. But here's what I want to say. Especially I want to say this to people who look like me in a time like this. This is a time, I believe, for us to listen and to learn. And so that's what I want to ask you to do tonight. I want to ask you to listen. Like really seek a posture of humility and seek to listen Be quick to listen, slow to speak. I want to ask you to lean in. If there are moments that are uncomfortable for you, if there are things that are said that challenge you, rather than leaning out and giving up and throwing your hands up and walking away, I just want to encourage you to, as humbly as you can, lean in. And then I want to encourage you and invite you to learn. See what you can learn. There are going to be so many things during this conversation, opportunities for you to hear something from a different perspective and to learn. I've asked these people, these are my friends, and I've asked them to be on this conversation with me because I love them and I trust them and I respect them and what they have to say. And so I'm really, really excited for all of us to get to engage in this conversation together. So without further ado, let's go to our conversation on race and the gospel. Well, hey, everybody. I want to welcome you to this conversation with some of my very favorite people. I want to introduce everybody and make sure you know who everybody is on this call. First of all, if you're part of our Village family, you know Chris Cummings. Chris is our youth pastor at the Village and is doing a great job in leading our teenagers. And what I think is really awesome is that in a time like this, it's our teenagers who are often leading us and leading the conversation, leading us forward. And you've seen a lot of the things happening around the country, and a lot of those things have been led by teenagers in different communities. And so one of the things that we have said from the beginning at the Village is that we don't believe teenagers are the church of the future, because we believe they're the church now. And so just excited to have you on here with us as part of this conversation. Joy Bronson is on here as well. Hello, Joy. It's good to see you. Joy, if you've been part of our Village family, Joy will be familiar to you because she's part of our Village family. And while she was a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where she graduated with a Master's of Divinity, she was part of our church. And she's since gone on to follow her call to some different and exciting things. And so Joy has been for over 15 years. She's worked with justice advocacy and community relational formation. Joy is currently, I wrote this down, so I want to make sure I get it right. Joy is the Lily Grants Coordinator for Congregational Calling and Vocation Initiatives at American Baptist College. She's an equity justice coach and consultant with Cause Impact in Ohio. And she's the Strategic Alignment Coordinator for Glencliff UMC in Nashville, which is a mission-based church. So you don't have a lot going on, sounds like. And something I love about Joy is an encourager, Joy is a bridge builder, and Joy is a prophet. And that mix of encourager and prophet are not two things that often go together. But I think you have both of those gifts. So I'm really excited that you are on this with us. And then last but not least is my good friend, Stephen Handy. Stephen and I have known each other for a long time, many, many years, which I will not say how many, but Stephen is currently serving as the pastor at McKendree United Methodist Church, which is downtown Nashville. He's been there for 12 years, which the landscape around that church has changed pretty drastically in those 12 years. Stephen, I remember the very first time I heard Stephen speak. Stephen is a passionate preacher, excellent preacher, and this was a youth event probably 20-ish years ago in Knoxville at Thompson Bowling Arena. And Beyonce had just come out with a song called Crazy in Love. And Stephen came out on the stage, and I think his opening line was about 20,000 teenagers. His opening line was, Beyonce says she's crazy in love. I want you to know I'm crazy in love with Jesus. And the whole place went wild, and it was awesome. But I think, Stephen, that is, to me, that epitomizes who you are and who I've seen you to be, is somebody who is absolutely crazy in love with Jesus. And I've seen that in your ministry and your preaching, just in who you are as a human. And so really, really glad to have you on here with us for this conversation tonight. So thanks for being here. This is an important conversation. And it's maybe for some of us, it's a difficult conversation, or maybe an uncomfortable conversation. And I think it's a really, really critical conversation that we have right now and help facilitate, and that's around race and the gospel. And it feels like we're at a really critical point here in 2020, and maybe a turning point. Maybe a turning point for our culture, for our country. And so there's just some things that I would love to talk about and hear more about. And I want everybody to know I'm approaching this whole thing from a place of humility and there's a lot of things that I don't know. There are so many things that I don't know, and I'm hoping to listen and to learn and to engage in this. And I think there are a lot of people who are in that spot. So I'm really hoping that we can enter into that together for this conversation. So I want to start. I want to start by maybe talking about something that it's a phrase that's been at the forefront, and it's become, sometimes it's become an argument at the forefront of the conversation right now. And so I'm just wondering if we could maybe enter into some conversation around that. And how I've phrased this, we kind of talked about this beforehand. I said, there's a lot of talk about lives mattering. And anybody who's paying attention to the conversation right now is able to hear that clearly the phrase Black Lives Matter is a really significant phrase right now that's being spoken. And but the observation culturally is that, so some people are saying Black Lives Matter, and then some people, and this has been happening for a few years now, some people sort of argue back, well, all lives matter. And then there's some people who even have started a thing about police called Blue Lives Matter. And I'm kind of wondering if we can talk about lives mattering and specifically the phrase Black Lives Matter. And again, I think I'm sort of approaching this from a help us understand posture. And so that's not I didn't have a very good question there. It's more of just an opener. What is it that we're talking about? What do you think is at the heart of that conversation, or what's, I think, sadly become a little bit of a debate?
Well, I can start.
Sure, yeah.
So, I wouldn't call it a conversation. And the reason I wouldn't call it a conversation is because I think a phrase came out that a lot of white folks didn't understand.
Yeah.
And instead of seeking to understand, we started coming up with our straw man concepts of what it means, and then arguing about these straw man concepts. And I say this because I remember very clearly the first time I heard a white person mention the phrase. It was someone saying, oh, I was just at this meeting about justice in the community. And one of the advocates was talking about this Black Lives Matter campaign. And I was like, oh, yeah. And they were saying, I just don't understand. Why are they saying that Black Lives Matter? And I'm going into this. So we're going to walk through. My thing in my work is I always give the question back to the person who's asking it. So like when white folks are asking why do Black Lives Matter, very simply, so we're going to start in our pre-conversation, Stephen mentioned, for example, we don't start at 1619 with African Americans being enslaved. We start with indigenous persons being initially, literally the beginning of genocide against indigenous persons by white persons who had come to this country. And then we can get up to the enslavement of Black persons. And then we can get up to a whole war that we had to fight to free Black persons. And then we had Reconstruction, but Reconstruction quickly turns into a series of what become Jim Crow laws to continually disenfranchise Black persons. On the sidebar, we're still breaking lots and lots of treaties with indigenous persons. We're now close to 600 broken treaties with indigenous persons over land rights in the U.S. And we get through Jim Crow. We get to the civil rights movement where Black folks finally get to vote unimpeded, but not really. And then we get up to, so a lot of folks don't know enslavement didn't necessarily end because there's a clause. That's the show or the documentary on Netflix, 13th, actually documents that the 13th Amendment has a clause that you can actually still be held in servitude if you commit a crime and are incarcerated. And
Wow.
so, for example, a lot of folks who are incarcerated today are basically performing free labor for lots of companies, like literally pennies
Mm.
an hour. And that mass incarceration was basically instituted to make up for the fact that there wasn't free labor. So we get into all of this, and then I ask the question, tell me where in our country's history Black lives mattered equally to white people's lives.
Yeah.
That then we get to the 21st century, and when Black people are saying Black lives matter, because we're needing to say that Black lives matter equally, why is it that white people are then hearing the question Black, or hearing the phrase Black lives matter more? Why do we need to add a
Yeah.
two? It should already be inherent, because it is very obvious when we know history and we pay attention to history, Black lives have never mattered equally. So I always give that question back and then ask the person, I need you to explain to me why, when you heard this, you heard Black lives matter more,
Mm.
when Black lives have clearly never really mattered at all in
Mm.
this country. And so I go like person to person, because that individual needs to help me understand where they're getting this misinformation from, particularly because had you looked at the Black Lives Matter platform when it originally came out, it explained very clearly what it meant. So I'm winding back to when you said the conversation.
Sure.
It's never been a conversation. It's been a very one-sided straw man argument, because unfortunately, white people do not converse with Black people, and white folks very often do not listen to Black people. We are told what we mean, we are told who we are, and then we're supposed to defend that. And I don't know how I defend your creation of who I like, you're making up who I am and what I'm.
Joy, I want to thank you for offering historical context. That is critical. And I think what happens to many people, especially our white brothers and sisters, is a lack of knowledge and understanding. And so when I think about kind of the Methodist Church and those who are Methodist, I always like to try to tell our history. In 1968, we decided to be a part of this church as Black people. In 1939, there was a central jurisdiction that pulled all the Black people out of the connection and put us in a central jurisdiction that separated us from white folk. In 68, we decided that that was not a good idea and that we needed to be integrated. And so literally before I contend this new age of Black Lives Matter, the Methodist Church was on the cutting edge in 68 to really identify that phraseology, although they didn't use that phraseology. The intent was in the denomination that Black folk mattered and you need to pay attention to them. So I contend, Joy, once you talk about our lineage, right, the history, is that the resistance of when white people say all lives matter, they're resisting another voice of equity. And so when we're trying to promote our being, because at the end of the day, if we read our Bibles in Genesis 26, 27, 28, it says we're all made in the image of God. It doesn't say a certain group of people. And then when you look at our Constitution, right, part of our history, it says at one point in time, Black people were only 3/5 represented in the country. So who says that on purpose? If indeed you believe Black Lives Matter, how is that a part of our constitutional language? How is that a part of our church when this church of ours is in 68, it was 94% white and 6% Black or people of color. In 2019, based on the Pew study, it was still 94% white and 6% people of color. But we say we're an inclusive church and people of color matter, but the evidence would suggest that Black lives do not matter, have not mattered, and I often question, will they ever matter?
we were trying to have this conversation with our boys. We have 3 boys that are 12, 10, and 7. And we were talking about Black Lives Matter and trying to explain to the best of our ability. And we feel like we're failing. We feel like we're failing miserably most of the time. But one of our boys, coming from what I think is a real genuine place in his heart, he just kind of cocked his head to the side and he said, well, wouldn't you say that all lives matter? And can we maybe talk about, because there is interrelation there. And so maybe I'll try this and tell me where I'm going astray in my thinking on this. The notion of Black Lives Matter and all lives matter are very interrelated, but what I think I'm hearing is that for the history of our country, if you believe that all lives matter, the reality is that Black lives have not mattered as much as all lives. And so to say Black Lives Matter isn't to say, Joy, to your point, it's not to say Black Lives Matter more. It's to say, if you believe all lives matter, saying Black Lives Matter is saying you believe all lives matter equally. Is that fair? Is that am I off on that?
Yeah, and so this was funny. I was like, "Oh, we promised Travis we were going to do Bible," but I had talked long enough, so I was like, "Well, but that's so." So I pulled up. We're referring to Genesis. I pulled up Genesis 1, verse 31. And so God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. And I think that I have definitely heard folks, so there are the folks who use all lives matter as a dismissal, needing to acknowledge the horrid history in which Black lives have not mattered as meaningful and significant to everyone in this country. And I've at times heard folks like your sweet precious child, who as soon as you said, he said, I smiled, I was like, oh, you precious little baby. And seriously, because he is where I've even heard grown, and not just white Christians, but also Black Christians be in the sense of, but everybody matters to God, and everybody does matter to God, as Genesis tells us. But y'all, when we're in this, and God made everything and it was good, and everything was received as good, and everything was treated in the equity and equality that it was good, it was in the Garden of Eden. And I think we conveniently forget that right around chapter 3, we got ourselves booted out. We're not in Eden anymore. And the reason we're not in Eden is because human beings made a very concerted decision to not live in alignment with God's order. So it wasn't just Adam and Eve eating from the tree when God said, don't eat from that tree. It was God comes looking for them and they're hiding. And then God says, where did you get these clothes? Like, why are you covered? And so then they're lying and lying and lying. And then they're blaming each other and blaming each other and blaming each other. But at no point do they say, hey, God, we messed up. And we're going to turn back to you, and we're going to be in alignment with your order. So I think we sometimes like to think that we live in Eden because we see this lovely chapters 1 and 2 when God created the beautiful world. And we live in the world, but we're not in Eden. And where we are still is that mentality where we like to think that the way that we think the world should run is how the world functions. So we do not live in a world because we decided we were going to create the world in our image, which is how we get to this idea that some people are greater than others. So it's okay to kill an entire people to take their land, and it's okay to enslave some folks to make them work the land, and it's okay to bring in Chinese immigrants to build our lucrative railroads, but we won't allow them to actually be citizens, that it's okay to use each other to elevate ourselves. So I understand that there are folks who very seriously mean all lives matter because they mean in the holy sense, all lives matter. I have never, as a Black person, doubted my value to God. Mm-hmm. Every single day, I am aware that white people do not value me the way that God does. And those are two very different things.
And I think that speaks into this idea of like just the nature of like sin and evil, and like this like nature of evil, or like systematic evil around the world that you said enters very quickly into the story in chapter 3. And the idea when we're talking about sin, I think Bonhoeffer said sin, the nature of sin is a heart turned in upon itself. And so it's when we think that the story or everything is about me and not opening our hearts out to loving God and loving others. And I think that's what you're speaking into, is not everyone, but a lot of times, and like I grew up in a system where I grew up white middle class neighborhood going to a white private school. And so for a long time, I was oblivious to the system of racism in our country. And I didn't grow up in a family who was actively racist and making remarks. But I think just situationally, we were a part of a system that made it just like not part of our conversation. So like Travis was saying, he's talking to his kids about racism. I didn't have those conversations until much later in life.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something to that Joy, even just your history lesson is a step in learning that even the history that I was taught was not the full history.
Chris, you're bringing up what I think is a really important thing to talk about. You mentioned systems of racism, and something we're hearing a lot about is systemic racism, and often the response that I hear and that I've said or felt, just being perfectly honest, when I hear about systemic racism, I will hear people say things like, "Well, I'm not racist because I love everybody and I've got Black friends, and I don't do anything racist and I don't say anything racist." But as I'm learning in this, talking about acts of racism and talking about systemic racism are not the same. Well, they're related, but they are not necessarily the same thing. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about systemic racism and kind of what that is, what we mean when we talk about systems of racism versus acts of racism, if that makes sense.
So let me lean into the systems part.
Yeah.
So you go back and you think about it as a theoretical concept that is deeply embedded in the American soil and souls, people. Then you think about how these systems have always labeled superior versus inferior. Mm-hmm. And so anything that white is right, anything that is non-white is destructive and divisive and less than. And so we parceled off people's humanity. And the church has also been a part of that. I mean, we often want to talk about racism outside the bounds of the church, but the church is deeply racist. I mean, the westernized Christianity is a racist construct. And all the systems that we live in are colonized systems. And I don't hear many people, Joe, I know you talk about it. I don't hear many people talk about our systems as being colonized. So if you think about it,
I was going to say, I'd love to know.
We were all raised in a colonized system. I was taught by colonized people. I sat in a room of peers who were colonized. Now, put that in perspective. If I'm trying to decolonize a system and I was colonized by the system, how do I believe I can disrupt it unless I learn some alternatives? And I think what America has to learn today, that you created this system that, by the way, if you created it, chances are you don't want to disband it. You don't want to disrupt it, because by definition, you benefit from it. Your whiteness, regardless of if you were in a trailer park or considered white trash or considered elitist, whatever that is, your whiteness gives you benefits that it doesn't give people of color. Now, let me also say that white is a color. The challenge is those of us who are darker hue than the established white people suggest that because you are darker, you are less than. And so we have policies in place, racist policies that perpetuates that we are less than, and we're calling on our brothers and sisters who are white of the dominant culture to speak up. First of all, speak up, get educated enough. So what Joy talked about, this historical contextual reality and analysis, you need to know that.
Yeah.
I don't need to continue to explain away your ignorance. What I need you to do is jump on board and immerse yourself in this educational process that's outside of how you've been educated.
Yeah.
Christopher Columbus did not discover America.
Hang on.
I know, right? Wow. What do you
let
mean?
our minds blow up for a second.
So if indeed that is true, let's just say that we perpetuated that truth. Why were there Native Americans here when Christopher showed up? What he discovered was that he was going to take control. He was going to offer a racist construct to a group of people who were not his color. And so we have in America, we have anti-Black practices. And whether you think you participate in them or not, by not speaking to them, not taking a stance, not preaching on them, not teaching on them, you have said it's okay. You've not opened your mouth. You've not affirmed that it's okay, but your behavior has said, as we talked earlier, I was walking in my subdivision. I live in Brentwood because I chose to live in Brentwood because I want to remind people in Brentwood that I'm here. I want you to hear that. I moved to Brentwood because I need Brentwood to know that I'm here. I walk my neighborhood often. With Kobik, I've walked it more often. I was walking in the second part of our subdivision called Phase 2. That is in Williamson County. I'm in Brentwood, Davidson County. Taxes are cheaper. Strategically, my location. So I'm walking around a cul-de-sac, and this woman who's on her driveway walks up to me and says, "Good morning. Do you live here?" Well, first of all, that's a racist comment. She didn't perceive it as one, and I didn't call her on it, but here's what I did say. I said, "I've lived in this subdivision for 20 years. How long have you lived here?" And probably, I think she said 5 years. My point was, I've been here. I know more than you know about this place. Don't chastise me. Don't dehumanize me. Don't devalue me. You don't have that right. What you have a right to do is to be informed, is to listen to those who have suffered from being in the womb. I contend that I was suffering in my mother's womb, being born in America. And so I was born into a racist system. And the challenge is not around this idea of white privilege. I tell people all the time, I'm privileged in America because I earned mine. My father and mother earned theirs. My grandparents earned theirs. Some people inherit.
Yeah.
If you're part of a racist system, you get to inherit your benefits.
I don't want to interrupt you.
Let me just say this
Yeah.
last. This idea of society being racist is something that Joy and I, we're 400 years behind. So when you talk about equity and you bring us in the room with others who are white and you say, now we're equal, I say, no, we're not. I'm 400 years behind. When you tell me that you're going to put me in a cross-racial appointment because you've not helped the system understand my value as an African-American pastor. I walk into that sanctuary and one of those people, I'm 400 years behind. I need you all to hear this.
Yeah.
Don't think because you put me in a room, I'm equal. What you have a tendency to do is suggest because I'm in a room, you're finished. Job done. No, that's when it starts. So we have to deconstruct this system that is deeply embedded in the soils and the souls of America, and primarily in our churches. And I've often said, until the church is desegregated, I'm not sure our chance of dismantling racism is.
So go ahead. Yeah.
So since we're on something that Chris said along with what Stephen said. So Chris said something along the lines of like he recognized that he was missing history. And that is something that I think is critical because so what I ran down historically is often counted as Black history or Indigenous history or people of color history. And I'm like, no.
That's just history.
Well, not even that. What I just ran down are things that white people did. This is white history. This is intentionally omitted white history.
Yeah.
And that's part of the focus of my ministry is literally what stories do we tell to and about ourselves? What stories do we exclude? Because it's not an accident. We tell the stories we tell on purpose, and there are things that we cut out on purpose. And what does that mean about how we can go forward? So if I'm missing critical pieces of who I am, I cannot go forward in helpful or holy ways because I'm essentially telling myself lies. Now, God knows who I am, and Holy Spirit knows who, and more importantly, not who we are, but where we are. If we can't tell the truth about where we are, we're not beginning at a healthy place to get to where it is we want to go. And so and when we're talking about systemic racism, Stephen made the comment about from his womb from his mother's womb, being born into a racist society. And that's actually true of all of us. So one of the things it's really important for me to think about in my ministry is, so in the United Methodist Church, Wesleyan theology, our concept of original sin is not, we're all sinners because Adam and Eve sinned and we're all stained because of what they did. It says that original sin is that we are all sinners because we are all born into a world where human beings have decided to sin and be against and do things away from God. And then we are taught to do that before we really have the opportunity to know any differently or any better. So that to me is how I contextualize systemic racism. You really can't do anything about the fact that we were taught to do it. And when I'm saying we, because when Stephen also mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folks earlier in our previous conversation, not here actually, and there's this concept of double consciousness where as people of color who are being oppressed by whiteness, we are taught to see ourselves the way whiteness sees us, even when we know how God sees us and who we really are. So there's it's called internalized oppression, where we are taught just like white people to preference whiteness and center whiteness. That's how that system works. So white folks don't really have to be taught as much while we're great, because who doesn't want to think you're great? We're all great, right? We're all wonderful. That's how God created us. But this human system also says, but in order for us to be great, these people can't be. And that's where we start getting into this broken system. In order for us to have things, these people can't have them. For us to be good, these people must be bad. And so it becomes this ongoing cycle. And I mean, I do hope that you continue to have that conversation with your sons, because we are aware through research studies that children start to be embedded with white supremacism as early as the age of 3. So white parents are usually like, we don't know at what age to have this conversation with their kids. Are they at the age that they're asking questions? Start having the conversation, because they're asking questions because they notice how the world is working. And that's like, you as individual parents may be doing the best that you're able to demonstrate treating people equally and so on and so forth. But the world as a whole already does not do that. And they're seeing how the world functions, and they're taking that in too. And I think it's something around the age of, Chris, you would probably know this because you're the youth pastor, at the age of 14, I think it's around the age of 14, what they see in the world actually starts to have more of an impact than what's happening with their family. So they've already been taking that stuff in, but then around the age of 14, in addition to what they've been getting at home, they're getting more of an impression from the world. So it matters. That's what it means, that it's a system. It's everything everywhere giving these messages, and we don't exist in a vacuum beyond it.
Can I want to kind of bring something out that I think is, I know it, especially when I first started hearing about it, was a real struggle for me, the concept, and I think is a struggle for a lot of people to hear it and to understand it. And that's the notion of white privilege that, Stephen, you mentioned that, and Joel, you were talking about white supremacy, white privilege. Because I know for me, when I think about my life and my experience, I was born to a teenage mom. My dad died when I was 3. We lived in a trailer park. My mom remarried. Had parents who loved me, but we didn't ever really have a lot. We didn't have a lot of money. I think I was the first person in my family to go to college, and kind of worked my way through there. And so when I first started hearing about white privilege, it was difficult for me, because in my mind I thought, I haven't had a lot of privilege, so I don't know what that. And then you hear about, or you see these videos of, it's like the privilege test, where, if this was true for you in your life, take a step forward. If this was true, take a step forward. If this is, and I've done some of those things before, and I'm often not several steps forward, in the same way, just in my own experience. But what I think I'm learning about that, would love to hear more about what that means, is to say that I have white privilege isn't to say that I had a silver spoon handed to me upon my birth, and that it's not to say that everything in my life has been easy. And it's not to say that if you're a white person, that means that everything in your life has been easy and you've never had to overcome difficulty and you've never had to work. But I wonder if we could talk just a little bit more about, even if there are some specific examples, like Stephen, I know you mentioned earlier the talk that you've had to have with your boys. Yeah. And I think there are some things like that may be helpful for people who look like me to understand a little bit more what we mean when we talk about white privilege.
So let me offer a few, because Joy is so much better at this. I actually like to hear Joy talk than I like to hear my own voice. But we talk about societal advantages that are based on, Travis, your whiteness. Once again, whether you leverage those or not is a whole different question.
Right.
It's characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So once again, you parcel off these people and you get to be in this camp, whether you take advantage of it or not, but you have the collection of benefits because you are white. And you receive this because of a racially structured system in society that says you are better. And it's predicated on a racial hierarchy. And so there's white male, white female, African-American female, and I think the last two have been shifted over the last probably 30, 40 years. But at the end of the day, the white male is above all. He's the emperor. He is the biblical terms, he is Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh calls the shots. Pharaoh creates the narrative. Pharaoh, Joy, you didn't say this, but I'll say it. Pharaoh controls the narrative. So I'm educated based on the Pharaoh's system. Now, I say white privilege versus my privilege because I'm a Methodist pastor. I have several degrees. I am privileged. But my blackness in the midst of being privileged has some limitations. Your whiteness has no limitations other than the ones that you allow to be. I don't have that option. And so as my boys were learning how to drive in the Black community,
I think this is a great, I think
we have
a great example of what you're talking about.
Us, but we have boys, and so they get their driver's license, and we're excited, but we're not. Because we know at one point in time, they're going to be on the road. And like George Floyd, they could get pulled over while being Black, driving while being Black. Simply, I was having that talk with her and said, let me tell you what to do. If you get pulled over, and I said, wait a minute, when you get pulled over. You see the difference? When you get pulled over, I need you to talk through every move you make before you make it. I need you to be as courteous as you can, and I need you to breathe. Because we want you to come home. We'll deal with it once you get home. But if you can't come home, we can't defend any sense of justice. And so my boys get it. So every time they go somewhere, they text us, I'm here. Every time they leave somewhere, they text us. It's annoying. But it's necessary for us to know that they're in a good place. My oldest, who is hopefully graduating from MTSU in August, I'll get a raise. But this idea that he works for a pizza place, Papa John's, and he's a driver. And so every night we got to get a text. We got to get a text, or we don't sleep. So imagine every night of your life, you're not sleeping because you are worried that your child may not make it home. So I had another incident with my youngest, who was with some friends, 3 white friends, and they were off driving somewhere, and they got pulled over, and my son got pulled out and questioned. And he did not understand why the other 3 white males did not get questioned. That's it, because your skin tone says that you are dangerous, that you can create problems, that you have too much power, and you
Sorry, Stephen, I don't mean to interrupt you. I even want to pause and ask, can we rephrase that? Okay. Whiteness has decided.
Yes.
Your skin tone.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Joy. And so what we have in this complex layering of who's in and who's not is that now, as a parent, and a parent to other Black boys and Black girls, by the way. So I don't get to parent my own children. I get to parent the community. I get to parent the neighborhood. And so every night, imagine, Noah was out the other night. He didn't come home till 12 o'clock. We were up. Because we can't sleep until we hear that the door unlocked and we know that he's fine. That's what I was born into. My dad had that talk with me. And my white colleagues have never had that talk. I'm not saying that you need to have that talk, but why don't you have to have that talk?
Yeah.
That would be a probing question.
That's exactly what you're talking. So that's a concrete example of what you're talking about. So my boys go out on a bike ride. They go out in the neighborhood. I'd never have the thought, hey, I need to talk to you about how you might be approached and what you need to do in that scenario. And I think I just want to go back to what you said. When you said, you were saying if you get pulled over, and then you changed it to when you get pulled over. And so what you're saying is your experience and the reality of our culture is, if you are a Black male, there's not a question of if you're going to get pulled over or if you're going to get questioned. It's just a matter of here's what you need to know about it when it happens. And my wife went to high school in Memphis, and couple of friends that she spent a lot of her time with. There were three of them. There was another white woman, and then there was a black man, and the three of them were best friends. And she has been looking back on that time, and she said this would happen. She didn't even think about it, why it was happening, when it was happening. But she said the three of them would go into a store, and almost without exception, the security guard would approach their friend and have a conversation with him while the two of the others who were there in that group continued to shop. And I think that's what you're talking about. That's the kind of thing that you're talking about. That is not even on our radar as white people, that we have to think about things like that. Are there other just kind of concrete examples of how that plays out, or how you've experienced that? Because I think that's helpful, again, for white people who especially think, I've had, like, my life's been difficult, I haven't had it easy. But again, that's not what we're talking about. It is a different set of issues. And I just wonder if either of you have some other kind of concrete examples of what that's looked like for you.
If we could go back, you referenced the what is that thing called? It's not a game, the privilege line. Which there's a video of on YouTube. And really the best way to do it is you need a group, you need a multiracial group of folks, and you need folks across socioeconomics. And what usually happens, no matter what the group is, because I want to tie that white privilege is a part of systemic racism. Mm-hmm. It's not this idea that every single white person, it's not even just, it doesn't mean your life is hard. It's not saying every single white person ends up with a Lamborghini and a mansion and a paved road of brick in front of their house. It is in systemic racism the idea that white people in general are not only given preferential treatment in society, but are given advantages other people are denied. So the privilege line video, I think, is a good depiction, because how it usually plays out is, even if there are a couple of white folks in the middle and further to the back, most of the white people are at the front.
Yep.
And then people of color start somewhere, you often start somewhere at the kind of middle beginning and straggle, and then end up congregated at the back. It's literally a depiction of how not just the history of our country, but that part of the history of our country is the ways that laws were intentionally constructed by white lawmakers to make sure that white people had access to money and things, and people of color were very intentionally denied access to those things. So I mentioned to y'all the Richard Rothstein book, The Color of Law, wherein he lays out the history and U.S. legislation of ways that, so for example, in housing, and Travis, you said this, a lot of people don't ask the question, or Chris, you may have said it, but one of you asked, why do I live where I live?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question.
Yes. Stephen pointed out he intentionally lives in Brentwood. God bless you for that ministry, brother. And in the sense of, as a Black man, I heard you saying God called you to be there and to live there for the reasons that you shared. And that's not easy. For the very reasons that you mentioned of you're walking around your own neighborhood and getting asked, do you live here? And you're like, I've lived here longer than you. But in U.S. history, there is this concept of redlining, wherein banks literally drew red lines on maps of where they would lend money that white people would live and where Black people would live. And the red lines are around the neighborhoods where not just Black people of color were not allowed to live. And that's how we end up with white communities. What this ends up doing, so historically, the U.S. government tells us over and over and over, home ownership is the most important thing you can do for equity and to build your family's wealth. So what happens is you end up with all of these white neighborhoods that are considered were actually the homes would be considered more valuable than comparable homes in neighborhoods of color, just because white people live there. Well, everybody wants to live here because white people live here, so the homes are more expensive. So this is not a matter whether or not Black people can buy the homes, because Black people literally were not permitted to live in these neighborhoods, would not be given loans in these neighborhoods. Written into the deeds that the owner was never allowed to sell the home to a Black person, or it just sometimes outright said a non-white person. Sometimes it specified a Jewish person. So even when we're just talking about building home equity, both the places that people were allowed to live that actually built home equity, and not only were, so white neighborhoods were upvalued and neighborhoods of color that were comparable were devalued. And that already starts to create this greater economic barrier. And who's building familial wealth? And that's what we're talking about. We already didn't have a large Black middle class because we're still recovering from being enslaved. And the several instances, I mean, I think there's actually a couple dozen, wherein Black communities did build up wealth and white folks literally came in and destroyed them, because Black people were not allowed to be wealthy and not allowed to succeed. The whole furor about President Trump's rally in Tulsa on June 19th is, one, that it's on Juneteenth, which is the celebration of the emancipation of Black persons from enslavement, and two, because May 31st and June 1st of this year were the 99th anniversary of the destruction of the successful Black neighborhood in Tulsa. I think, this one was Black. It was the one that was considered Black Wall Street. Yes. And very seriously, the reason these neighborhoods were destroyed is because it was Black folks becoming economically wealthy, and white folks were like, we don't want you to do that. Yeah. So when we're talking about privilege, white privilege, we're talking about it in a historical system of race. Not today, all white people are racist, but for about 600 years, white folks have been racist and done everything possible, including in our literal laws, to ensure that people of color are not on equal footing, that all lives do not matter equally, even as they matter equally to God. And so you may, as a white person, you may have worked very hard for what you have, but people of color are absolutely forced to work harder to have near what you do. You can look at the simple numbers of Black wealth versus white wealth, and it's not because Black people are lazy. We worked in fields for free for like 200 years. We're clearly not lazy. It is a matter of there have been very intentional processes put into place to ensure that white folks in general do fare better and have better advantages than do white folks.
That's so helpful. So to think about. Go ahead, Stephen. Yes, please.
Mention two examples. Early 70s, Jefferson Street, North Nashville area was a thriving community until some folk believed it was a great place to build an interstate system. So they literally built the interstate system through the Black community, through it. It's not recovered since the 70s. There's a community called Germantown. Germantown used to be across the street from another community called Dodge City. Dodge City back in the 70s and 80s was a very violent place because folk sold drugs and guns to our folk, and they pitted us against one another. All of a sudden now today, I would say probably 4 or 5 years ago, Germantown has gentrified to the extent that one of the worst performing schools is in Germantown area called Buena Vista. 99% Black, 100% free lunch, reduced lunch. And all of a sudden, across the street is a housing project. Our folk, I call them modern day concentration camps. Across the street from that is Germantown. Germantown, about 4 or 5 years ago, sold $1 million home. When I lived in North Nashville, that would not have happened because we lived there and the property value would not ever have been that high.
Yeah.
Today, this systematic approach of getting rid of the housing project, getting rid of that school, so that gentrification can be deeply rooted and that community transitions to white. So I invite my brothers and sisters who really want to be in this disruption movement with us is to be informed, to know about this city. 37208 is the most mass incarcerated zip code in the country. It's in Nashville. Nashville is the 5th most segregated city in the country.
Wow.
Yes, we have growth. Yes, we have economic opportunity, but there's high levels of economic injustice and environmental injustice that are happening for most cities. It's either in the north side of the city or the east side of the city, where they have regulated us to be there and not given us the resources.
Yeah.
So the worst school is not because we're dumb. We built this country. To look at the structure of this country architecturally wise, we built it.
Yeah.
And so we're not lacking intellect. We're kings and queens that came over here to be slaves.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just so much of this. There's so much in the sea that we're swimming in that we don't even see and don't even recognize. And so, and I think what you're pointing to specifically right now is that empirically, data-driven neighborhoods that are viewed as white versus neighborhoods that are viewed as Black, the property values are higher, which then leads to generational wealth. That's something we were hiking at Radnor Lake a couple weeks ago. Again, 12, 10, and 7, those are our boys, trying to have a conversation about generational wealth and generational poverty and what that looks like and what that means. There's also implications for the education system based on property taxes. You can have 2 schools in the city of Nashville that are both publicly funded schools that have vastly different resources. And on the whole, again, and I'm saying this is like a statement in the form of a question. On the whole, neighborhoods with higher property values that take in higher property taxes have more resourced schools than schools in neighborhoods that have lower property values, lower. So all of that leads to generational impact. Is that? I'm stating that as a question. Are those things true? What I said in terms of how I'm trying to understand.
I'm going to let my other colleagues jump in here, but I just want to say it's by design.
Yeah.
It's not an accident that Buena Vista, one of the worst performing schools in the state, is 2 streets over from one of the most affluent communities in Nashville. That's not an accident. It's by design.
No. And Joy, I'll let you speak to this. I just want to, no, you're good. You mentioned the question, why do you live where you live? Like, why did you choose to live there? I have noticed just naming systematic racism feels off-putting when you have never seen it before. You've experienced it, but if you've never seen it before, and this is coming from like how I grew up, but when you say, why did you choose where you live? Then you start naming things like it was a safe neighborhood. It had better schooling. The amenities around the area were great. We liked the people, which normally means they're like us. And when you start paying attention to those answers and then looking into, okay, so how do we get there? It points straight to the system we're talking about that has been built to allow white people to win, essentially, in the society. So
I want to, Joy, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you.
So I was going to say, Stephen, what did you say? basically he said like this is intentional, like this is planned and purposeful. And then this is so funny. The Holy Spirit was like, you shush and let Chris speak. And this is what, because so you said like when you've been raised so you don't experience it. And I'm going to again turn that around and say you do experience it.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm saying not experience, but like you don't talk about it.
Yeah. So you experience it, but because your entire world is in fact constructed out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It is also constructed for you so you don't see it. And that's, I think, so you're not aware of it. But I do want to say that so white folks are aware you are experiencing racism all the time. You are living in it, and also needing to be aware that you are participating with the perpetuation. It's not just happening. It's something that we're all keeping going when we make the choices that we make. And so going back to Stephen's, like, this is by design, I want to point out this is not a holy design. So we want to talk again about this is all happening because all lives matter to God, but we're not living as if all lives matter to human beings. Turning back towards God means we have to live as if our lives truly do matter, and stop just saying all lives matter dismissively when somebody's pointing out, here's how we know our lives don't matter. And that we have a holy call and challenge to start deconstructing. And this is not a thing that we do to be nice people. We have a holy responsibility as Christians to address white supremacism and racism.
So that's exactly. Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, this is the last thing. So I'm going to share this, and I'll make sure to send it for the resource list. So we've been talking about so we had mentioned examples of, so here are personal interactions that Stephen had, and then here are things that happen on a federal level. And Stephen gave some personal, some direct history about Nashville. I want to share, it's a little dense, but if you are a reader, this is a book called Making the Unequal Metropolis, and the author is Ansley Erickson. This is actually a book about the history of school desegregation in Nashville.
Oh, great.
So for those of us who are like, well, this may not have anything to do with us, one of the reasons I love this book is because they went ahead and broke down, here's how we get the intersection of racism and classism, and right here in Nashville, in ways that have led us to how we are all together today. When we're talking about Williamson County versus Davidson County and which schools are funded and which are not. And literally the things that individual white parents did, like groups of white parents did and did not do, that led to the way that we see our city shaped today, because our education is also how we're setting up for our future. So it's actually one of the most critical things you can understand about a city is not how is the housing market, it's how are the public schools. That is actually one of the most definitive markers of the health of the city.
Travis, let me jump in here real quick around and this is critical. And when we talk about the Bible and being people of the word, and how Wesley informed us that the quadrilateral was important, but we take a baptismal vow. And I think we have missed this statement, and I'll read it. Do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever form they present themselves? And we have the audacity to say, I do. It's a said statement. It's not an acted statement. If we are to reclaim our baptismal covenant and live out of it, we would be a people who would be in the midst of disrupting all of these injustices, all of them. So I'll call us back to our baptismal covenant.
Yes.
To remind us of who we say we are and what we said we do. So we have some broken promises.
Yes.
And so who gets to hold us accountable for that? We do, each other. We're humanity. So I'm done.
No, that's actually exactly, that's where I wanted to turn, because we're talking about we're talking about the ways that systems have been created with intentionality in our history. And what I want to talk about is exactly that. We've made a vow that as followers of Jesus, we're going to do something different. And I was reading and convicted this morning. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. It says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice." Or the Message says it like this: speak up for the people who have no voice. And that hit me in the heart this morning, because I need to confess that I've not spoken up. And I've not used my platform. I've not used my voice to speak or to act or to intentionally live up to that vow. And we are, that's something the four of us share, is we are passionately committed to Jesus and following the way of Jesus. And so just as people who believe in the gospel and the fact that it's a message that's for everyone, that we're supposed to be known by our love for one another. What I'm wondering as we sort of conclude our time, and I wish we could keep talking, there's so much more, and I think there's some space for us to have some subsequent conversation. But as people who are followers of Jesus, who are trying to figure out what can we now do with intentionality, what would you say in terms of? I said this at the beginning. I am ignorant, and I am seeking, and I am learning, and I don't know always what to do. I know I need to do something. I know I need to say something, but honestly, I don't always know what that is. And I think there are a lot of people in that boat. And I feel like culturally right now, we're in this moment where it feels to me like there are more people who look like me who are paying attention, and wanting to know what to do. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts or wisdom or words on that.
One of the difficulties of that question, it presupposes that you now want me to tell you what to do in the midst of burden.
Yeah.
And I would do a joy strategic reversal and say to you, we read the same Bible.
Yeah.
I need you to hear that, because I love you, bro.
Absolutely.
We read the same Bible. We all read Micah 6:8.
Mm-hmm.
So now in this moment, people have been calling me, my white colleagues, what should we do? And I said, well, what do you think you should do?
Yeah.
What does the Bible teach you to do?
Yes.
I can't carry your burden. So I've had a freedom. I've had a liberated moment in these last probably 3 weeks that I tell my colleagues, I am not positioned to carry your burden. I am positioned to help you share. I'll share that with you.
Yeah.
But you're not going to put me in a compromising position. You talk about COVID-19, right? You're not going to put me in a compromising position to have to carry your burden. As much as I love all of God's people, that is not my role. My role is to walk with you, but also that you have to be willing to say, I need to be disrupted. I need to live in the discomfort because I was born in it. I don't get a day off from it. And by golly, no one else should either until it's fixed. And I don't know what fixed looks like, but I do know I'm a sanctification guy, right? And at the end of the day, I am called to move on towards perfection. And that means Monday through Saturday, I'm not talking about Sunday morning when we get to proclaim the good news. Monday through Saturday, as you see the inequities, you have to position yourself right now to say something. So real quick, I'm working on a book, and it's called The 4 Stages of Being Woke. Okay, 4 stages of being woke. The first stage is awareness. And it's the 4 A's. Self-awareness is most critical, and then communal awareness. Who you are, what's your identity, and who are the people around you. Number 2 is acknowledgement. How have I contributed to the system? This is going to be quick. I'm not writing a book yet. Number 3 is...
I'm writing it for you right now. I'm trying to
get
it all down.
Advocacy role. What is my advocacy role in this? That means now it's time for me to speak up. But sometimes we're not careful. That turns into a rhetoric moment. And rhetoric moments don't last long. So then we move to activism. So now I need to do something with it. Then I move back to awareness. So it's a cycle that I live through every day on purpose, in intentionality, because that's who God has called me to be.
Well, no, I would say mine is probably very similar to Stephen's because, I take very seriously in my coaching. As a calling and vocation coach, I cannot tell you what God called you to do. Mm-hmm. I can affirm you and I can affirm that I see gifts in you and I can walk, but I cannot tell you what God created you to do. I have not been with you on the journey of your whole life to tell you, oh, you need to do this and you need to do that, which is why I have had to learn this myself, stop telling people what to do. And I was joking with Travis earlier this week. The Holy Spirit has been trying to get me off Facebook, and all of a sudden activism, everybody is suddenly a racial justice activist on Facebook. And I was like, so I'm gonna go ahead and get off Facebook because a lot of this is incorrect, and I can't be here right now. But I would very much agree with Stephen, in the sense of, I would say for us as Christians, one of the things that I notice we have a tendency to do is we read the Bible and we identify with the heroes, and not literally that we have heroes when there are really no heroes in the Bible. David was a hot mess. Solomon was a hot mess. Like literally the only character in the Bible aside from Jesus who as far as we know is a super good dude is Hezekiah. And he has like 3 verses because they were like, if we go any deeper, you're going to find out how he was a hot mess. So,
yes,
that we really need to think about how we read so I'm going back into the stories we tell. Because the stories we tell are how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive our world. And we've been living in this story of white supremacism. And so when I'm saying white supremacism, I'm literally meaning the supremacy of things that are associated with whiteness. We have been living in this story. That's the system, or one of the systems that we've been living in, that are literally destroying all of our relationships and killing people of color. So when we read the Bible, thinking about the way we read the stories that we read, why are we leaving out the foibles of the folks that we consider to be heroes instead of letting them be whole people? And then why do we, when we're thinking about how do I identify, we never identify with the quote unquote villains. So everybody thinks we're Peter. Nobody thinks we're Judas. We're both. We have been both. We will be both. And Judas was not only Judas. Judas was a whole person before he betrays God. And in the reality of his story, we don't know why he did what he did. We've made up all these stories just to say he's a villain because it's easier. So we again fall into this dichotomy of good and bad. There's good people in the Bible, there's bad people. Be a good person, except that the quote unquote good people are actually kind of a mess. So that means we end up being kind of a mess because we don't have realistic frames for how we are thinking about how we exist and how we live. So I then bring that into this conversation to say, one of the things that white people have to do is imagine that you do racist things, that you have done racist things, that you have hurt people with racism, that even in your learning, you will continue to do racist things. But in sanctification, in that journey of perfection, and the reality that God threw nobody away in the Bible, even as people continue to turn away from him, and God is not throwing any of us away ever. We get to continue to grow and learn and transform. And that is what our journey means as Christians, as United Methodists. It's not to be perfect people who never mess up. It's to know that we are people, so we're going to mess up. And God loves us still, and God is calling us forward still. And the only way forward is for those who always want to go to racial reconciliation, we are not getting there. So, Stephen, I think one of your A's was it acknowledgement?
Yes. Uh-huh.
So just again, until we can acknowledge who we've been and where we are, we cannot go forward in a healthful way. So I always tell people, I don't want to talk about reconciliation until we can talk about, again, our history, because until we can tell the truth, we can't live it. So that is the thing I would give to folks is we're going to have to start learning to tell the truth, and we're going to have to start learning to face the truth, and not just about the fact that there's racism in the world, but that I am perpetuating it, and I have to be willing to let the Holy Spirit show me how and lead me away.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I really appreciate both of your answers to that, because I have seen, and I even asked the question, like, so what do we do? And the thing I keep sensing, and maybe I think I've probably been guilty of this in the past too, and I'm trying not to be guilty of this now, is when I'm asking that question, I'm saying, what's the one thing I can change so I can go back to my normal life? And I think that, I mean, let's just be real. Like, and we've done this with COVID too. Like, how do we do the one thing so we can go back to our normal life? And I don't know if what was normal is what God's calling us to. In fact, I know it's not. Because God is always listening to the hearts of those who are crying out from oppression and in slavery. And our system of racism has been the oppressor. And for the church to defend the oppressor is a really sad place that needs repenting. And that's hard. And that doesn't mean it's an easy switch. Let's just be honest. So, having grown up blind to a lot of this and not now, going back through my story and my history and just realizing all of those things is really hard. But I have known personally and in my faith, when it gets hard, that's when I grow. So I'm excited about this opportunity for growth, and I'm also fearful of what I'm going to find. So that's where I am right now.
And I do want to add one last thing that's I think it's kind of a more tangible piece to what I said. So one of the things I've encountered when we have community conversations about race, there are conversations that I don't attend anymore because we have white folks who are like, when we set the guideline is basically, I don't want to be yelled at. And there is we kind of talked about this the other day, Travis, and this is, I think, slightly different than what we were talking about. But in terms of, if Black people are going to express their emotion about 400 years of oppression, I don't want to participate, because I want a very bland, I don't want to have to feel anything about this. I just want a checklist of what I need to do. Exactly what you're saying, Chris. I want a checklist of what I need to do, and then I'm going to check it off, and I am a good white person, and I'm going to go back to my life. And so we're not trying to be good white people. We're trying to be good Christians. I'm not here to be, I am Black, and I am proud to be Black, but I'm not here on this earth to be a good Black person. I'm here to be the best Joy that God created me to be. And I'm here to be a great Christian. And part of that is being Black, and bless the Lord. And, but wanting to say to that, white people cannot truly enter into this work if the whole point is to be patted on the head by Black people, because I don't have time to pat you on the head. And also, I am not the determiner of whether or not you are doing your faithful work. God is. White people cannot enter into this work if the point is, as long as I get to hold hands with Black people, because we may not want to hold your hand. We're mad. It's been 400 years, and we're mad, and we have a right to be mad. But also, stop making this about you. I'm not mad at you even if I'm yelling at you. I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at all of this. We should all be mad with all of this.
Yeah.
This is not who God created us to be. This is not how God put us here. Part of the reason I entered into the work I do is because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, went to predominantly white schools. I've worked in predominantly white spaces. 80% of my friends are white. And at some point I thought, white supremacism is keeping me from having the healthy relationships that I should have with my white friends, because we have to navigate through this crap that none of us created just to be able to be together. So again, it's not about everybody being friends, but recognizing this end that a lot of white folks hope we are going to magically snap our fingers and get to is not going to be possible until people show up because we want to love with one another genuinely, and not just because we want everything to feel okay. Yeah. And so like the normal, Chris, that you're talking about, that's the feel okay, because that was not love. That was not love. That's why we are segregated in churches still on Sundays, because we don't love with each other, because some of us cannot stand next to others of us, because others of us are harming. Because we won't be responsible for who we are. And the last thing I'll say, because Travis is kind of like, we gotta wrap it up, which is true.
So good.
We said we weren't going to have the whole conversation today, so I'm going to say my last piece. I did say that I wanted to say this, and it is very important for white people to understand that none of us who are alive created racism, but we are all responsible for healing it and for cleaning it up. So this is not a matter, for me, this is not a matter of, and I think that's why I mentioned most of my friends are white. I wouldn't be like, this is your fault, but let's be friends. This is not a matter of blaming or shaming people. This entire thing is a matter of saying we are living in a toxic dump of unholy relational dynamics. And we should want to clean that up, because this isn't healthy for any, like white folks will straight up say, I don't have that many privilege. Good. Then you have just as much reason as I do to dismantle this system, and let's build something genuine and real with the Holy Spirit if you don't think you're getting anything out of this. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to ask one last quick thing, and then Joy, I'm going to ask you to pray if you would. Is there one thing for people who are hearing this conversation and they're wanting to like, we've scratched the surface and they're wanting to go deeper? Is there one thing you'd recommend, a book people could check out, something to watch, podcast, anything for somebody who's going, this is opening my eyes and I just want to take a next step in learning more about this? Is there one thing you'd recommend?
Yeah, I'm going to add a 1A, 1B. How about that?
That's great.
There's a podcast called 1619 that I would recommend everybody listen to and have a conversation afterwards. And then I want to suggest that you simply just do something. Izzy Gilmore, a rising fourth grader, came to our prayer vigil in downtown Nashville because we needed a credible public witness. We did social distancing, had on masks. After that, a few days later, she asked her mom, why haven't we done anything in Mount Juliet? This is a rising fourth grader. And she says, Mama, we need to put a Black Lives Matter sign in our yard. So there was an African-American man jogging that day, and he said he'd never seen anything like that in this subdivision. It's predominantly white. Izzy had a peaceful protest yesterday in Mount Juliet, about 100 people. And it was absolutely fantastic. She's a rising fourth grader. So we're not talking about intellectual capital, right? PhD to do this work. We're simply saying if a fourth grader gets the movement of the Holy Spirit to say there's something wrong, I need to do something, be guided, not by the other spirit, but by the Holy Spirit. I don't have to distinguish. There's several spirits out there. The Holy Spirit will lead you to a place of equity where there's inequity. And then read the book with a group of people, How to Become an Anti-Racist. There's some good stuff there, but I also ask that you have an open mind to it. One writer doesn't have the whole truth on anything. So as you read everything, read it with a sense of there's some gaps always. I know when I read, there's not a perfect book ever been read, but it's a move. Mm-hmm. It's a move towards something greater than ourselves.
Thank you.
The Bible, Stephen. The Bible is a perfect book. I'm kidding.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm hoping that people are reading that, especially pastors.
Yeah.
Was that your 1A and 1B? Am I talking over you? I'm so sorry.
No,
I was agreeing with you about the Bible. That's
no. I was asking Stephen if I talked over it. He said he had a 1A and 1B, and I wanted to make sure he got that.
Got it.
Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
So I'm going to share something parallel with Stephen's. One of the things I have learned is white folks have a tendency to get resources and then read them and be like, good, I know how to do it. And it's like, that's not how that works. Just like with faith, you got to practice it now. I'm actually there is a podcast that Chris actually recommended to me. And Chris, I'm going to ask you to say the name of it because I don't remember off the top of my head. Do you not remember off the top of your head?
I have recommended so many podcasts.
Okay. We can
which one are you talking, like that we talked about on the mission trip?
Explaining the history of sweet potato pie versus...
Oh, the nod.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason I want to recommend a resource or resources like that is because I think it's important for white people to engage spaces where Black folks are just being Black. Well, we're not teaching you about your history that you just decided you didn't want to know anymore, which is why you don't know it. But again, we're not having a conversation about like why it's not a point of confusion about why we don't know each other. It is, we've said so many times over this conversation, white people didn't have to know, so you didn't bother to know. And a big part of the disconnect is, so there was this research study, and I think it came out in 2015, 92% of white Americans have no friends of color. So a lot of white Americans have opinions about people of color, which is so interesting because 92% of white Americans have no friends of color. And they literally define that as people with whom, so you may have met them at work or on a softball team or whatever, but you meet with this person outside of those spaces. So it's not like casual or causal. It is literally you intentionally connect with this person, and you might have dinner at each other's houses, and not because the softball team had dinner, but because y'all wanted to have dinner together. And you might share. 92% of Americans have no actual friends of color, or white Americans have no friends of color. So a big part of the problem is white supremacism compels white folks to make up things about people of color that you obviously can't know anything about because you don't know any people of color. So I would recommend a podcast like The Nod and see if we come up with some other ones, because you have to learn about other people just being people. A lot of the division and even the fear that's generated around Black people, it maintains itself because white people don't actually know any Black people. And so it's easy to believe something that you've been told and about somebody you don't know. And even if you have the one friend, that friend is usually seen as that's my Black friend, but we don't really think of them as Black. So are still not seeing that Black friend as maybe what I think about Black people is wrong. If this person is Black, they just become an exception to the lies of white supremacism. So I would absolutely recommend something like The Nod, because just listen, Black folks, and you cannot just go make Black friends. You please don't do that. You may encounter Black people and you're like, I would like to be friends with you. That's great. Please do not go on a mission and just make Black friends or friends in any way for that reason. But find spaces where you can learn about people from the people instead of what someone else told you about them.
Thank you so much. I wish we could keep going, but I don't want to continue to take more of your time. But this has been so incredibly helpful. So grateful, Stephen, for you, and Joy, for you. And I'm looking forward to further conversations. But thank you so much. Joy, I'd love it if you would pray for us to close out our time.
Loving God, we thank you for your spirit always with us and always among us. We thank you for how you gather us, and that when you gather us in and with you, not just to be together, but to learn who it is we are together and how we are together in you. We are thankful for this conversation today. We're prayerful that we are not just hearing, but as in all faith, seeking what it means to live fully, meaningfully, and faithfully what we hear from you today. And we are prayerful as we go forth, not just to have received a word, but to be mindful of how we will live that word in your love, in your grace, and in your faith with one another. In the name of our holy and precious Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. It's been a blessing to be with you all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you again so much for being part of this with us tonight. And again, a huge thank you to Joy and to Stephen for joining us, for leaning in with us in this, what I think is a really critical starting point of conversation for each and every one of us. So I hope you've heard something tonight that's been helpful to you. I hope you've heard something that's been challenging to you. And I hope you've heard something that's going to make you think differently, or begin to explore some different thoughts and ideas, because that's what we're hoping to do, is to continue to open up this space for dialogue, for connection. One of the things that Joy said as she was closing that I think is such a great encouragement to us is find spaces where you can learn about people from people. Find spaces where you can learn about people from people. And so that's an encouragement. I want you to know we're going to be putting together a resource list based on what Joy and Stephen have recommended for us, and we'll be putting that together and sharing that with you. If you have other questions or want to have further conversation, I'd invite you to email me. You can do that directly, travis@thevillagenashville.com, and I'd be glad to connect with you or help you connect with some resources or further conversations on this. Again, so grateful for you. Thanks for engaging with us tonight in this conversation. And I look forward to seeing you sometime soon.